Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 3. Today, I want to talk to you about something that I personally struggled with for a long time, very intensely, intrusive thoughts. If you don't know what intrusive thoughts are, or if you need a little bit more background, intrusive thoughts are often related to memories of past painful events. They're sort of these unwelcomed projections of things that you would never voluntarily choose to think about if you had control over them. They don't always require a trigger. Sometimes they don't ever require a trigger. You could be sitting on your couch comfortably watching a funny movie, and all of a sudden you're kind of overcome with these negative feelings and emotions. They're constant and nagging and repetitive, and more often than not, negative. I didn't know that I struggled with intrusive thoughts for a really long time. I had never heard the term intrusive thoughts up until a certain point. I didn't know what they were. I thought to one extent or another, everyone sort of had a voice inside their head, sort of an inner monologue. And, sometimes it was positive, sometimes it was negative. And it wasn't until I verbalized what was kind of going on inside my own head that I realized how abnormal these thoughts that I was having so frequently actually were. I want to start off by kind of tracing back where I think these intrusive thoughts started. I moved out of my parents' house after a pretty traumatic family event that took place one night, and then the next morning I was out. And so everything that I had been taught that was important, everything that I had known in my life up until that point, suddenly now was completely flipped on its head. My relationship with my parents would never be the same. And all of these things that I had really grown to value and these things that I thought were important and right, now were all of a sudden called into question. So after I moved out of my parents' house, I think altering that relationship and kind of questioning all of these things and losing so much of that normalcy that I had grown accustomed to my entire life definitely triggered a bit of separation anxiety for me. I think I was always a bit of an attached kid to begin with. And I think that sort of stems from my parents sheltering us and being controlling. I wasn't really allowed to just go out with my friends when I was younger. I think the first time that I was actually able to go out with my friends on my own was when I was probably about 15. And so in elementary school and things like that, I was never able to develop relationships with my peers outside of school. That led to a lot of sort of ostracism, and that just kind of further developed my relationship with my parents, where we were very tight-knit. They were kind of like my best friends, and anything that we would do, we would all do it together. And so when you have that going on, plus now you're not feeling entirely included with the kids in school, it just kind of makes that bond that much stronger. And so I was definitely very close with my family, and I think sort of losing that overnight really messed with my brain a little bit. And so now I'm out of my parents' house, and I'm in the first few months of my relationship with my now husband. And I started to get these feelings where, before this, we would go off and do our own things. We weren't living together, so we would kind of have our own schedules, our own jobs, and everything was fine. But now I found myself, anytime my husband and I would be apart, I would start to feel really anxious. And I didn't even really know what anxiety was at that point. Looking back, I've experienced anxiety a lot. I was definitely a little bit more of a nervous or anxious kid in school. When it came like test time or anything like that, I was always wanting to do well. But this was a different kind of anxiety. It was very negative and heavy. It was hard to ignore. And there were times when it would be a more specific thought, where if my husband and I were apart, I would think that something specific was going to happen, that was going to get in between us, that was going to result in us never seeing each other again, or at least not seeing each other for an extended period of time. Other times, it would just be emotion, where I wasn't imagining any kind of specific scenario, or I wasn't kind of coming up with a hypothetical situation in my head for what I thought would happen. It was just a negative feeling that was entirely overwhelming. And looking back, when I was still living in my parents' house, when I was probably in my mid-teens, I was a very positive person. I've always been a very optimistic person and kid. And whenever I would have a harder time, whether it was in school or with friends, I was always really good at kind of stepping back, looking at the bigger picture, and kind of pulling myself out of whatever negative headspace I was in at the time. I was really good at listening to that more positive voice in my head. And I remember times in the first year probably of mine and my husband's relationship when I was completely inconsolable. And I would be telling myself all of these things that I always told myself, that this is just a feeling and that everything is going to be fine and that, none of this is really grounded in reality and that I'm just feeling this way right now and that it's all going to be okay. But while I'm telling myself these things, I am hysterically crying, just I guess sort of having a bit of a panic attack, just like hyperventilating, breathing really heavily, not able to control my emotions. And so I think that's where a lot of these intrusive thoughts started, when I sort of developed this separation anxiety and I would start to think that anytime my husband and I were apart, especially for, an extended period of time, which to me at that time was an hour or more maybe, that something really bad was going to happen that was going to get in the way of our relationship and prevent us from seeing each other again. Thinking about it now, I feel like that also kind of stems from all of the things that my parents did to try to sabotage mine and my husband's relationship while I was still living with them. Then I think this kind of morphed into me thinking about myself and my place within our relationship. And I remember when, my husband and I would be hanging out with a friend of his, and he would go to walk his friend out and, maybe he would be there for 5 or 10 minutes or so before his friend left, just, saying goodbye and whatever. And I remember in those moments feeling so paranoid, thinking that was when they were talking about the things that they really wanted to be talking about. Or maybe they were talking about me and how they couldn't talk about certain things when I was around. Or they were talking about things that they didn't want me to know or hear. And I would get so paranoid that this is actually what was going on. And it wasn't until years later when I started to realize all of these things and how abnormal it all was that I brought this up to my husband, and he very calmly just was like, no, like that never happened. I would never do that. And these thoughts were not based in reality. They weren't kind of taken from any real life experience. My husband never gave me a reason to think that he would do those things. But the more I thought about it and the more I sort of traced it back, the more it made sense to me. So much of the negative behavior that I observed was centered around a husband and a wife, around a romantic relationship. And so when my dad and I would be talking about my mom negatively, saying things that he didn't want her to know or hear, and then she would come into the room and all of a sudden on a dime he would just switch up the conversation, and I would play along too. I would switch it up too, because that was what I was accustomed to do for so long. If you see your parents doing these things to each other around their kids, this is supposed to be such a safe space. What is going to make you think that anyone else in your life would do anything any different? If my dad is doing this, if my mom is doing this, why isn't my boyfriend at the time going to do this also? It was normal behavior for me. I didn't even know that I was expecting something so negative to happen, and that I was kind of pinning these really negative behaviors that I had grown accustomed to on someone who never gave me a reason to feel like that. I guess I just thought that everyone acted this way. And it was really eye-opening to realize that not everyone does. And so this would happen a lot. And I guess my brain, taking it one step further, would continue to kind of come up with these hypothetical scenarios in my head. And I wasn't consciously making the decision to think about these things or to make these things up and sort of play them out. It would just happen. And it was really constant and it was really repetitive. And I felt like I couldn't really do anything, especially because I hadn't recognized what these thoughts were. I felt like I couldn't really do anything to fight against them. And so they were very consuming and at times felt more real than what was actually going on around me. They sort of manifested themselves in nightmares of mine, in dreams that I would have. And this was kind of one of the oddest offshoots of intrusive thoughts. And this was before I even knew what intrusive thoughts even were still. So for a period of time, I would say for at least a year, maybe a year and a half, probably 3 or 4 nights a week, maybe 5, I would have the same kind of dream where I would be somewhere with my parents, in my parents' house, which always looked different for some reason in my dreams. And in my dream, I would realize, oh, it's been a little while since I've heard from Brandon or since I've talked to Brandon. And so I would try to find a phone. I would try to get in contact with him. I would try to go to him. But every single time there was something that was getting in the way. Either I couldn't dial his phone number, or my messages weren't going through, or I didn't know where he was, or I couldn't get to a car. And sometimes even if I would be able to get in contact with him, maybe call him on the phone or go to him, when I would get there, I would be met with what looked like Brandon, but he wasn't acting like him at all, where he would be very cold, or he would be saying and doing things that were really hurtful to me in the moment. And this happened consistently, like I said, for probably a year or a year and a half. And I think back to it now, and all of the things that my parents did to kind of try to sabotage mine and my husband's relationship, all of the negative things that they said about him, I feel like that undoubtedly played a part in these nightmares. And especially that night when I left, I knew the next morning that if I didn't go, I was kind of doing a disservice to myself, because I wasn't going to accept the behavior that went on that last night. And it makes a lot of sense that for so long, I just would have these nightmares of not being able to leave, not being able to get to my husband. Once I realized what intrusive thoughts were, and I started to understand why I was having them and how uncommon this was for so many people, that was when I was finally able to start managing them, because I finally was able to put a name to these emotions and these feelings and these thoughts. And knowing that it's kind of a symptom, it's a result of something that had happened in my life, made it a little bit easier for me to take them for what they were. Thoughts. It wasn't real, even though at times it could feel entirely real. And they do kind of make you face a lot of your biggest fears and your deepest rooted insecurities, because that is often what they play on, at least for me. Things that I feared the most, things that I was the most insecure about, that's what these sort of hypothetical scenarios and these unwelcome projections in my brain would be centered around. People in my life that I loved and cared about, that were important to me, kind of being faced with a decision, and then right in front of me making a decision or doing or saying something that was the most hurtful to me. That was kind of the common theme with a lot of these intrusive thoughts. And even though these people never gave me a reason to believe that they would act this way, it felt like if this happened, that's the way that it would go. I was kind of convinced of it. And so I was terrified of encountering a lot of these situations in real life. And so once I realized what they were, I was able to kind of process them just as thoughts. I was able to think about them and kind of tell myself, this is what this is where it's coming from. Is this grounded in any kind of evidence? Is this based in reality? Is there a likelihood of this happening, or is this just kind of that same thing again where you're torturing yourself in your brain? If it is, let it go. I have far fewer intrusive thoughts now than I've had in the last 4.5 or 5 years or so. And when they do still pop up, they do pop up occasionally. They're either triggered by something really specific that is still kind of something that's harder for me to deal with, or they're just a little random, but they're a lot easier for me to kind of pass through. They just kind of come and go, where they pop up randomly and I just recognize it for what it is. I think about it and then I let it go. And most of the time, it does just go, because it doesn't have any real power. And I've realized that what I was doing by entertaining these negative thoughts was giving them power to kind of keep coming back. And also, I was just torturing myself. I was living so much in a hypothetical negative future scenario that I wasn't fully being present and enjoying what was going on around me. And I don't deserve to feel like that. There's no reason that I should feel like that. And so it's worth it to kind of fight against these things to get on the other side of them. I could talk about intrusive thoughts for days and days, and I might do another episode on them at some point, but I think that's just about all that I've got for today's video. I did post a TikTok on this topic about a week ago, and I've got a ton of comments on them, and so I'm going to be diving into them a little bit further. And so if you want to see that, head over to my Patreon. I've got that linked down below, and that's just kind of taking all of these things a step further, getting into some specific scenarios with some of the comments that I've gotten on TikTok. As for here on YouTube, that's all I've got for today. So I will see you next time with another episode of It's Not Normal. Let's keep it moving, let's keep it moving, let's keep it moving.